Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we get started. And thank you all for coming out today to Government's Place in the Market with Eliot Spitzer. My name is Daniel Pritchard. I'm the Marketing Director of Boston Review. Boston Review is an independent, nonprofit magazine of ideas. We cover a wide range, from global politics and economics to contemporary fiction, poetry, and film. Please pick up a copy on your way out at the door or at the book table in the lobby. Today's event is the final installment for this academic year of the Ideas Matter lecture series. Ideas Matter is a joint project of Boston Review and the MIT Political Science Department. The goal of the series is to encourage serious debate, reasonable and fact-based, on key issues of public policy. Over the course of the year, we've discussed campaign finance, internet freedom and foreign policy, technology and poverty, immigration, marriage, and full employment. Today, I have the honor of introducing Professor Simon Johnson, who will be introducing our speaker, Eliot Spitzer, whose book, Government's Place in the Market, is about to appear in the Boston Review book series with MIT Press. Professor Johnson is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a co-founder of BaselineScenario.com, and a member of the Congressional Budget Office's panel of economic advisors. Professor Johnson is a regular contributor to the economics blog at TheNewYorkTimes.com, as well as Project Syndicate and Bloomberg, and is contributing business editor at the Huffington Post. He is also the author of 13 Bankers, The Wall Street Takeover, and The Next Financial Meltdown, a best-selling assessment of the dangers now posed by the U.S. financial sector. We are very happy to have him with us today. Please help me welcome to the podium Professor Simon Johnson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for turning out today. I think this speaks well of us as a community of people engaged with ideas. You didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to listen to Eliot Spitzer. And I'll let you have him in just a moment. His book is terrific. I recommend it highly. It's powerful. It's an easy read in some senses. It's a very deep read, and a read you should. It's worth reading many times and thinking about the points that he's making. Eliot Spitzer, I would suggest, he's known as the Sheriff of Wall Street. I'm suggesting we call him the last Sheriff of Wall Street, or the last one we had. We're still waiting for his replacement. As Attorney General of New York State from 1998 to 2006, Mr. Spitzer made an indelible impact on Wall Street and on our thinking about white-collar crime in the United States. He went on to become governor of the state of New York, where he had many pioneering and important ideas in the realm of education, healthcare, and economic development. Ideas I think that will continue to resonate as we try to sort out the United States and decide what we do going forward. He also hosts a powerful and important TV show in the arena, which you can see on CNN most nights. Mr. Spitzer, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you all for being here. It really is a privilege to speak here at MIT. And I was saying on the way in from the airport, I've always held MIT in a bit of awe because as opposed to the schools I went to, which have fair reputations, MIT was where you actually did rigorous thinking. There were numbers attached to most of the studies, and there were provably right and wrong answers. I always took courses, I told Michael, who's traveling with me today, I said I always took courses where there was an opportunity for partial credit. And that was, it was one of my important lessons I've tried to impart to my kids over time. I'm hoping I'm saying this early enough. My daughter, who's a junior a little bit up the river here at another school, is stopping by. I hope she hasn't heard me speak in such terms about Harvard, which is where she is. Anyway, let me say this about Simon. Simon wrote a book, 13 Bankers, that is really the book you should read. It is brilliant. It is a powerful critique of what has happened to our financial system. And I say this with all due appreciation, it is not an easy read. It taxes you, it pushes you, it makes you think. It is filled with numbers, complicated ideas, as his books always are and should be. But I would highly recommend it to you because if you really want to see what has morphed and what has happened in our economic structures, that is the book that will do it. I wanted to promote one other book today. I suppose I'm here to promote mine, so I will do that. You know, even though I was in politics, I'm always a little bit embarrassed when I'm purely involved in self-promotion, but it doesn't stop me, as you will see. The embarrassment is something you learn to live with when you've had my life. The boy, that made me lose my train of thought. The other book I really do want to promote is by Josh Foer, and it's called Moonwalking with Einstein. And if you haven't heard about it, it's a book about memory. We had him on the show the other day, and it was fascinating. He's from one of these families where all the kids, the parents, they're just brilliant, they do eclectic things. The reason I want to promote it is that we have had in our nation a case of universal amnesia that has really, unfortunately, permitted us to forget the last couple years. And the reason that's relevant to what I'm talking about today is when I was Attorney General, and as Simon said, I was AG from 98 to 2006, we did lots of things that led to the germination of the ideas that ended up in this book, and I'll get to that in a moment. But then we had this economic cataclysm. And at the moment of the economic cataclysm, people were forced against their will to confront some of the pure ideological boundaries and some of the ideological thinking that had driven us to the precipice, and in my view, over the precipice. And I thought, aha, we will have that epiphany that will teach us the lesson that will bring us back. We will finally embrace rational policy once again. And here we are about 2 years later, and I'm saying to myself, what happened? How can this possibly be? Didn't people learn the lesson? Didn't people see what happened? Haven't we taken anything from the crises, the cataclysm, the maldistribution of wealth, the absolute horror we have lived through? And I'm afraid to say the answer is no, they didn't. Because I see both in the politics of the moment, in the ideology of the moment, I see the conversation, which is sort of a word I don't like to use, but such as it is, the conversation down in Washington is at such a level that I am absolutely persuaded nobody was paying attention, or they don't do what Simon alluded to, which is to pay attention to facts. And I'm not talking about coming here so I can propose an alternative ideology that is equally distant from the facts we've lived through and the history we've lived through. It is very hard to have lived through the last couple of years and draw the conclusions that the Tea Party draws. I just think it's hard to do that and be a sane person. And yet they do. And it's very hard to live through the past couple of years and believe in the libertarianism of Rand Paul. And parenthetically, I interviewed him earlier today for our show, did a pre-tape of the show, will be live tonight, the rest of it 8 to 9, I recommend it. See, I said self-promotion is something that you learn when you're in the commercial businesses. But here he is, very smart, but he believes the libertarian stuff that he has been spouting for the past couple of years. And so when I say we need collectively to revisit our history, I really believe that. How can we be where we are today? Because I fear that as a society we're about to go over the precipice once again. Now, that was all preamble. Well, let me frame the conversation this way. I had an absolutely spectacular time when I was Attorney General, when I was governor, too brief as it may have been, because there's nothing better than being in the arena, hence the name of the TV show that I'm hosting these days. It is wonderful to be there and to actually be in a position to try to affect public policy, to think through these tough issues and go from the classroom and say, I'm actually sitting behind a desk, what should we do? And you do it in fits and starts. You experiment. That's why, Roosevelt's great quote, that you try something. If it fails, give it up and do something different, but at least try something. That's what governance is all about. There were moments that were just fun. I mean, one of my favorites, and so if some of you have heard this story, I apologize for those of you who haven't, at least I found it enjoyable. I was talking one evening, had been invited by the Wall Street analysts to speak at their annual dinner. And as I'll describe in a few moments, I had a somewhat fraught relationship with Wall Street writ large and with the analysts in particular. And I'll describe the case in a moment or two. But suffice to say that we had subpoenaed all the emails, pretty much, that had ever been created on Wall Street. And we were reading them, and they were not pretty to read, and they were certainly not pretty to read if you were an investor on Wall Street. I hope none of you are, for your own sakes. But actually, that's not true. Maybe you're front-running and you're doing just fine. But I got to the lectern, and I looked out at the audience of about 300-400 analysts, all in their black ties, because this was their annual awards dinner. And they were going to get awards, gold, silver, and bronze, I guess, for being the most proficient analysts at recommending stocks to the investing public. We had actually crunched the numbers and determined that those who were getting the gold standard, who were the peak, they're Olympians, Had you followed their advice, you would have lost 30% of your money that year. And it went on down from there. They really were not doing their clients a tremendous amount of, not helping them a great deal. But anyway, put that aside, I stood up at the podium and I said, it's nice to put faces to the emails. And they did not find that amusing. That was when the tomatoes began to whistle by the podium. It was, in truth, I can tell you, the only time my wife has ever said, you'd better have real security with you tonight. These analysts may actually rip you limb from limb. But fortunately, I can run faster than they can. They had had too many steak dinners. Where I want to begin is with this sort of simple realization, and Simon and I discussed this very briefly before we began speaking, and maybe we'll discuss it in greater depth in the Q&A. But we are at a unique political moment. There are many trend lines that are converging, facts that are finally being crystallized in the public's eye. I give the president enormous credit in the speech that he gave on the budget about a week and a half ago now. He had a sentence in there which was enormously important, where he stated something many of us have known and observed, but has not been restated often enough, which is that 90% of the American public for the last several decades has seen its income stagnant or declining. The top 1%, top 2% has seen its income going through the roof. This maldistribution of wealth is getting increasingly accentuated, and it is going to drive our politics over the next several decades unless we can reverse it. That's fact one. Unemployment now is, and I don't mean to give you just a litany of data points, but unemployment is not at the below 9% that is officially reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is really in the mid-teens at least when you factor in those who are part-time employed, those who are so disengaged from the labor force even though they would like to find employment that they've given up. And no matter how you count it, the U6, if you go to the BLS, is actually the more important number, mid-teens at least. And even beyond that, not to get too wonkish, but just to prove that somebody went to Harvard, actually knows a few numbers, the number that really matters is the workforce participation rate, which shows you what percentage of society is trying to work these days. That has declined steadily over the past decade, and it had been going up for several decades, which is a good thing. More people working, earning income, that is what had made the middle class wealth accretion possible. That number is down to, I think, 45.7, or something that is treacherous because it means the wealth being earned by the middle class is going down, 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 and even of that percentage, fewer are finding jobs, and this is a structural issue that we simply have to deal with. Another data point, in the last decade, the multinationals that are still the dominant players in our economy in terms of capital flows eliminated 2.9 million jobs in the United States at the time. They increased employment overseas by 2.4 million. Again, a net there of close to 5+ million jobs, a swing that is devastating if you think about what that means long terms in terms of wealth accretion and what the prospects are for the middle class. Two other data points. First, the debt crisis. And I don't need to give you the numbers, but we have a national debt that is going to quickly surpass our GDP. You can debate whether it's a near-term problem or not. At some point, it does catch up to us, and it's something we have to deal with, and we can talk about how and what the priorities should be, but it is a reality that is certainly out there that is now encumbering our political process in terms of making wise decisions about investment for the future. And then the last data point that was announced yesterday by the IMF, which is that when you use purchasing price parity, rather than simply the exchange rates that happen to be out there in the economy, the Chinese economy will be bigger than ours in 2016. Now, you can argue whether that matters. Hertz made a whole, Avis made a whole ad campaign out of we're number two, but we work harder, we try harder. I'm not sure politicians like to say we're number two. I'm not sure that the trend line is something we want to be proud of or happy to hear, but it certainly tells you that with projections that the Chinese economy would surpass us in 2030, 2040, that date keeps getting closer and closer, which proves the point that I think Neil Ferguson has made with some regularity, which is when you go over the precipice, it's always faster and steeper than what you think it's going to be. And so we are sitting here at an economic moment that is fraught with risk. And if something doesn't change fundamentally, then we are going to be in some sort of crisis. Now, against this backdrop, we have a political system that has been, I would say, been taken over by the Know-Nothing Party, and which is how I refer to the Tea Party, and nihilism. We don't know what we can believe in anymore. There really is almost nothing to believe in. And the Tea Party slogan, get government out of our health care, being chanted by people receiving Medicare, summed up the inherent internal contradictions and the lack of intellectual coherence to what was being said. But it is powerful. It is a powerful political movement. Leave aside the logic of it. And what does it say on the front here? Ideas matter. I mean, the ideas that the Tea Party is propagating are enormously politically satisfying. Sort of an anti-government venom. Who do we blame? We blame them, big, bad, ugly Washington bureaucrats. It's always they, the somebody else who's distant. And so it is resonating politically and has led to a dumbing down of our politics over the past couple of years that has been terribly problematic. It is sort of an anti-ideological perspective that I find difficult to deal with as somebody who used to be in the political arena. We all, I think, had enormous hope that Barack Obama, when he was elected, would change all of that. I mean, he was the vessel into which we poured all of our hopes, our aspirations, in a way that, frankly, was intensely unfair to him. It simply couldn't succeed as we had hoped it would. And we have since then been suffering from the sort of psychological letdown that is inevitable. And even I, in my role as TV pundit, obviously critique and say negative things. Moments I say, folks, let's just step back and be real. He was, as we've now heard, and of course we understand, he was dealt one of the worst hands in history in terms of the crises, the problems, the ideological strains in our society, none of which is sufficient to justify some of the mistakes he's made. So I can now, having given you that footnote, I can go on to be the critic. But he was dealt an impossible hand. And we expected of him that he would raise the ideological debate, he would give us the answer, and at least I was hoping he would give us the counterpoint to the Tea Party and to the sort of libertarian critique that had dominated politics for the last 10 or 15 years, dating back, or you can go farther back than that, to the rise of President Reagan. When President Reagan began to spread the anti-government theories that led to the destruction of the social contract that had guided our nation basically since FDR. So we have this absence of an ideology that stands in contrast to the Tea Party. The president, even though, as I say, I give you those caveats, has responded with a pragmatism that has been so malleable that there is no coherent ideology buried within it. And I think that is what has troubled many of his supporters. There haven't been any lines in the sand which he has said are inviolate. There haven't been any, such as, the easy one to pick, and I'd forgive him this one, is Guantanamo. There, I think he was foreclosed from pursuing the right solution by Congress. But extension of the Bush tax cuts, it's harder to excuse. And I don't want to discuss yet the fiscal crises. We can get to that later. But that one, it was harder to excuse his deference to a Republican majority that wasn't there until after he lost the midterm elections. He could have acted with a Democratic majority in both houses prior to that point, but he didn't. Lack of ideological fortitude, poor strategy, who knows? But the point I'm making is there has been an absence of an alternative ideology to stand in contrast to the Tea Party and the nihilism and the libertarianism of the Republicans. And that absence, I think, has led to a shifting of the political debate far to the right of where it should rationally be. And I think part of our disappointment with President Obama is that he has not constructed that alternative. In fact, I would almost say that his pragmatism has led him to become an anti-ideologue. There's an absence of ideology and a certain joy in his announcing over and over, I'm the pragmatist, I will rise above any ideological debate to craft a solution, the result of which has been that we have wandered aimlessly without a coherent counterpoint. I would suggest if you read Paul Krugman's articles with some regularity, I think he had a terribly important one last week where he talked about civility. And he said, sometimes we need the absence of civility. Sometimes we need the rigidity and belief in our core values to stand firmly in opposition to the other side. And by always being willing to compromise, we give away that fortitude. And hence, they continue to win negotiation after negotiation. And in fact, that's why, I did Bill Maher's show a couple weeks ago, whose humor is powerful critique as well. And he referred to the president as the conceder in chief. And there is an element to that. We are always conceding rather than saying, wait a minute, we have the votes, we are right as a matter of ideology. All right, all that is still précis. Where are we as a nation? This is not 1945 anymore. What do I mean by that? In 1945, we'd won World War II. The United States was the only nation that had capital, as in the sense of traditional capital, money. The only nation that had a middle class that could provide a consumer base for production. We were the only nation that had a firm rule of law that would give people comfort when they invested. The only nation that had competitive markets, which are, I deeply believe, the engine of growth. And we were the only nation that really had a firm, established set of institutions that believed in sort of liberal democracy. And I don't mean liberal as liberal conservative politically, liberal democracy in the classical sense of what governance is all about. As the only nation that had those essential components of growth, we went through several decades of unbelievable, unbridled, remarkable growth. It was a period perhaps without any analog in history. When I say that today is not 1945, the point I'm making is that we no longer have a monopoly, nor should we, on any one of those inputs. The reality is that the success that we have had in proselytizing to the rest of the world has meant that we now have to compete with virtually every other major country in the world in terms of capital, labor, creativity. It's a tougher world than it used to be. And in a very perverse way, that's a good thing. It's a good thing because when we were the only nation that believed in those values, it meant we had to fend off ideologies with communism, socialism, fascism, theocracies. Pick your favorite alternative ideology or least favorite ideology. We had to push back against them. Now, having won, we have to compete with them on a level playing field. It's almost, Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, got it kind of right. I mean, not totally right. I mean, there is still fanaticism out there. I think fanaticism is still the ideology that challenges us, and it comes in many shapes and forms. At any one moment, it takes, has one particular look to it, perhaps, but fanaticism is still what is threatening us in a very deep way. But because Fukuyama was right in the deeper sense that we've proselytized, China is on the rise. I mean, 2016, as I said, their economy may be bigger than ours, not because they believe in central planning, but just the opposite, because they believe in capitalism. If you speak to the folks at Goldman, and I'll say a bit more about Goldman maybe later on. I can't go half an hour without mentioning them. It's it is. How many of you, by the way, you guys are younger than I. How many of you want to go to work for Goldman? Now, don't be shy. Oh, come on. Some of you are holding back. There you go. All right. We'll talk afterwards. It's there's nothing wrong with it necessarily. It's But you speak to the folks at Goldman and say to them, where will most of the capital in the world be coming from 10 years from now? There's no question where it's going to be. It's going to be over there. And so we have won the battle, but in so doing, perhaps we have lost. And so we need to ask ourselves some very fundamental questions about how we structure our society to make it work. Now, I presume read, The World is Flat. You've read Fareed Zakaria's spectacular book, The Post-American World, and I hope read his follow-on pieces in Time magazine, which are distinctly less affirmative in terms of what the fate of the United States would be. Where his last one being entitled, I forget the headline, but basically saying the middle class is dead. I mean, there is no prospect here for the middle class. I'm not quite that dire, but this is the backdrop against which we have to ask some fundamental questions. And so the question I asked myself, and to come back to my days as Attorney General, is why are we doing these things? The cases we made ran the gamut. The Wall Street cases, as I refer to them, were certainly the ones that got the greatest attention, because when you talk money, you generate headlines. When you put names like Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Citibank on the other side of a litigation, attention is immediately stirred and people perk up. But we did cases across the entire range of environmental cases, labor cases, internet privacy cases, doing things that individually made sense. But after a few years as Attorney General, I said to myself, why are we doing this? Is there a coherent theory that explains what we are doing and why nobody else is doing it? I mean, this was the era when the libertarianism, or faux libertarianism of President Reagan had grabbed hold in Washington. The SEC had gone to sleep, the OCC, all of the agencies that have been created to protect the public against rapacious capitalism had gone to sleep and stopped doing their jobs. And so I said to myself, are we right or are they right? What are the boundary lines? Is there a coherent theory to explain what we're doing, or are these merely a series of one-off cases that might make sense, but there's no larger set of principles from which one can then judge and guide the future? And perhaps it was rationalization, but over time, what began to emerge to me was a set of principles. And so what I want to do very quickly is sort of throw those principles out to you and say these, and they're not, they're neither terribly well developed nor fast and without limits and footnotes as you think about them, but they at least would give us the initiation point of a conversation about, as the title of the book says, what is the role of government in the marketplace? Do we buy into this notion, the libertarian notion that government should do nothing? Maybe that's a little bit of a caricature. Or do we buy into this notion of an overreaching, overbearing government that second guesses every decision that's made? Of course, that's also a caricature, a straw man that's easy to knock down. But where is that subtle intermediate point where you both have a market that functions with independent decision makers moving capital and bringing innovation, creativity to the table, and a government that somehow makes it all work with a social contract that keeps in mind our responsibility one to the next? Which seems to me somehow we had that social contract. We had that understanding and balance between the period roughly 1932 to 2000. Maybe not 2000, maybe it's 1980, but pick your end point. Somehow we had a rough consensus about what those rules of engagement were. And during that period, we saw enormous growth and enormous wealth accretion for the middle class. Since then, it's been trouble. All right, so let me give you what these rules are very, very quickly. The first, and it's so obvious that it almost shouldn't need to be restated, but only government, and I say this, only government can enforce rules of integrity, transparency, and fair dealing in the marketplace. Private sector companies simply can't do it. And I will very quickly tell you the story of the first big case we made against Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch was, as you probably remember, should remember, a major investment bank. It had, thousands, tens of thousands of brokers who gave advice to individual investors across the country, analysts who recommended stocks, buy, sell, hold. On the other side of Merrill Lynch were the people who did the underwriting, who did the IPOs and the secondary offerings for companies. There is an inherent necessary tension between these two sides. Why? Because when Merrill Lynch was bidding for clients to say, we want to do your underwriting, for which they got enormous fees, they would promise that their analysts and their brokers would push the stocks whether or not they were good purchases. They would say, you bring us the underwriting, pay us tens of millions of dollars in fees, our analysts will get people to buy the stocks, and the fact that it's not a good stock, too bad, people will just have to suffer. This conflict of interest pervaded what they did, pervaded what everybody did. We brought this case, got the emails that I referred to earlier. The emails were replete with bad language. This is for C-SPAN, so I can't use it. If it were late night cable, I could. People understood when you read the emails that the brokers were denigrating the stocks they were recommending. We brought Merrill Lynch in. We filed suit. The first conversation I had with their lawyer, he said to me, and this was their most sophisticated legal argument, he said to me, Elliot, be careful, we have powerful friends. And I said, I'm not sure that's a legal argument. And he said, well, it's the best we can do. And I said, well, that doesn't bode well for the case. But they came in, and we then had a fascinating conversation. How many of you want to be white-collar defense lawyers? How many of you want to have jobs at all? I mean, this is, a few of you. All right, well, that's good. The next generation hasn't completely thrown in the towel. That's nice to say. The reason I asked is if you want to be a white-collar defense lawyer, you will understand the litany of arguments you make. The first one is the person who made those comments didn't have the authority to speak on behalf of the company. Then you say he took it out of context. Then you say he didn't understand our business model. And then you check to see how much insurance you have. And they didn't do any of those things. They really didn't. They came into my office when I was AG and they said, Elliot, you're right. You're absolutely right about what you've diagnosed, this tension, this inherent conflict of interest. But they said, we're not as bad as our competitors. Think about that as a defense to their behavior. And what does it tell you? I mean, they were right about that. Some of the other banks, were worse in terms of the cravenness with which their analysts would recommend stocks that were clearly both inappropriate investments and just bad investments. But their point was, as long as our competitors are doing it, we are going to be driven down to a lowest common denominator because our drive for market share and profits precludes our worrying about the underlying ethics of what we're doing. Think about that. Now, I'm not saying they're bad people. Really, I'm not. I'm not saying everybody who worked at Merrill was a bad person, just as, that would be silly on its face for obvious reasons. But this was the dynamic of the marketplace. The dynamic and the pressure was so overwhelming to actually get market share that they threw to the wind concerns about the integrity of what they were doing. And so only we could come in and define that lowest common denominator and say, here are the rules, the guidelines you have to play by. Now, I want to give you another example of that, much more recent. The report that came out just last week, Senator Levin and Senator Coburn, bipartisan report. You had a reasonably liberal Democrat, Senator Levin, and a very conservative Republican, Senator Coburn, who parsed the entirety of the record of much of what happened and transpired on Wall Street, but specific to Goldman. And really, I'm not picking on them, but if you read this document, it is kind of astonishing. Put aside the inconsistencies between the testimony that day when you had 4 reasonably senior executives at Goldman testifying before Senator Levin, whether that leads to perjury charges, of course, others will determine. But the reality here is that Goldman Sachs understood no later than December '06 that the market, the subprime market in particular, was going over a cliff. It was going to be a disaster. They then ended up taking a short position, which at its peak was $13 billion. $13 billion short position on the subprime market. This is an enormous position even for them. This was not just market making. This was not just ensuring liquidity. This was a $13 billion short position, contrary to what they've said elsewhere. And they knew that they could profit by betting against the market. I have absolutely no problem with that. They want to do that, that's great. But let me step back for a minute. All the years on Wall Street, when I was making Wall Street cases, the response I got from the Republicans in Congress, from the investment banking community, from the ideologues who were pushing back was self-regulation will work because the markets will mend their own problems. Leave markets to themselves. Let the markets take care of these issues. Both of the ethics of the marketplace and the self-corrective nature of the marketplace will solve the problem. We don't need you as a bureaucrat to ensure that there is some degree of integrity. So here's the question I then ask after you parse the entire record. When Goldman took this $13 billion short position, did they ever, and parenthetically, they were selling the subprime debt, the CDOs, the credit default swaps, all the sophisticated stuff that they created, because the smartest minds did go to Goldman, and they're incredibly smart and nuanced in what they do. Did they, while they were selling all of this stuff to their clients, ever pick up the phone to a single regulator and say, you know what, it is time to rein in this parade. It is time to slow it down. We're heading over the cliff. No. Did they ever pick up the phone to their clients and say, get out of this market, it is dangerous? No. Did they ever call the rating agencies and say, you know what, we are shorting the very products that you have just given a AAA rating to because we understand that your ratings are meaningless. You'd better change your rating system. No. They did none of that. They simply bet against the market. Now, as I say, I have not only no problem with their betting against the market, one could argue they had a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders to do so. But it seems to me if there's any credibility whatsoever to the notion that the market can regulate itself, that the actors, the most sophisticated, the smartest, theoretically the best of the players in the market, which is what Goldman Sachs is, could stand up and say, we've got to slow this down, we would have seen evidence of their trying to do that at some point along this paper trail. It's simply not there. Complete absence. And so I've said to them, look, show us we're wrong about this. Prove to us that you in fact did try to rein in the system. Chuck Prince, who was the CEO of Citi at the time, said something that's become quite famous. He said, as long as the music is playing, we will dance. Think about that. As long as the music is playing, we will dance. In other words, as long as there's a game there, we'll keep playing it. To which my response was, whose responsibility is it then to turn off the music? Whose obligation is it to stop putting quarters into the jukebox when you see that this is going to lead to a cataclysm? Clearly, the banks didn't think it was theirs, just as they didn't think it was their job when the analysts were misleading the public, and they knew it, to stop. So that's hence point one, only government can do this. It doesn't mean we do it right all the time. It doesn't mean our solutions work. Separate conversation, we could have that, but only government can step in and do it. Let me run through the other 2 rules quickly. And I hope the second one is obvious to all of you. And it relates to the single most important word that is not often enough discussed in economics classes, and that's externalities. We all learn supply and demand curves. We all learn the beauty of equilibrium when those 2 curves intersect, and we say, aha, we've solved the problem. Supply and demand curves reflect the bargaining and the relative interactions of private parties who are party to the transaction. Externalities reflect the positive or negative impact of those transactions on people who aren't party to the transaction, but yet there's a societal cost. It could be a positive or negative cost, right? Positive and negative externalities. Classic example on this one is pollution, all right? Pollution is a negative externality because when, and I'll give you a real life example, when a coal plant out in Ohio buys really cheap coal, that happens to produce a lot of pollution, the people who are living right there get to buy cheap electricity. So they bid up demand for that cheap electricity, which generates more and more bad pollution. Nobody in that environment who's party to that pricing transaction pays the price of the pollution, which may be increased asthma, and may be global warming, and maybe the trees in the Adirondack Park. I care about things in New York still do for obvious reasons. The trees in the Adirondack Park are going to suffer from the acid rain. Nobody in that transaction cares about that. They're not party to it. That is a negative externality. That's why we have the Clean Air Act. I'll get to that in a second. We sued when I was AG, we sued a lot of the power plants in the Midwest on this very principle. And when I went down to testify about it one day, Senator Voinovich from Ohio, who'd been the governor of Ohio beforehand, looked down at me from the dais and he said, Attorney General Spitzer, when I was the governor of Ohio, we cleaned up the power plants in Ohio. Why don't you just do the same thing in New York? And I said, Senator, I applaud you for that, but do you remember how you did it? He said, no. He said, well, you did it by having your power plants build 1,000-foot tall smokestacks. Now, why did you do that? You didn't do that because they're pretty. You didn't do that because they're cheap. You did it because when you build a smokestack that's 1,000 feet tall, the pollution goes up and it doesn't come down in Ohio. Right? It goes up into the jet stream. It doesn't even come down in New Jersey. That would have been okay with me. Or Boston, since you guys have the Celtics and we don't. That would have been great. It comes down in New York. And so as a New Yorker, as an attorney general and a lawyer, the only thing I know how to do is to sue you. So that's what I'm going to do. And we sued them because we said we need you to internalize this cost. In other words, only government can say, private parties can do it, that's why they're private nuisance actions, but really at a certain level government has to do it. Government can measure these negative externalities and try to impose behavior modification upon the economic actors to diminish output, or get people to switch to natural gas, or whatever. Not here to discuss energy policy. The point is, if there's a negative externality to high sulfur coal, you measure it and you take corrective action. But the people who are party to the simple transaction of buying electricity near that power plant don't see that cost to society. Government can and does. This is a very conservative notion. You go to any economics textbook, it will spend a lot of time talking about externalities. There are positive externalities too. We think of positive externalities, education. That's why we subsidize it, right? Good thing to do. Point is, externalities are a critical reason for government to participate and alter the outcomes that you otherwise get from two private parties who simply reach an equilibrium point. Hugely important. Third argument I want to make, and this is the one with the greatest latitude, relates to core values. There are certain core values that pure, unbridled market behavior does not respond to or deal with or address. And I would give you as one that I think we can all appreciate: discrimination. There were those who were sort of libertarian in their outlook who said, we don't need to pass laws that make discrimination illegal. Why? Because discrimination, they said, is inefficient. If I'm running a restaurant, I own a restaurant, and I discriminate and say I won't serve people who are over 8 feet tall, or I won't hire people to work in my restaurant who are 8 feet tall, I'm losing customers and or losing smart people to be in my workforce. Ultimately, because I'm less efficient, have less revenue, I will go out of business. Now, it's logical, I suppose. Right? There's an internal logic to what they're saying, and obviously if you use the real objects of discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation, you're excluding larger pieces of the population. So theoretically, they're right. But you know what? Historically, they're wrong. It just didn't happen that way, right? People did discriminate on race, on gender, sexual orientation, and for whatever reason, I think it goes to the human psyche, the societal pressure to continue to do that overweighed the economic cost. And so whatever the actual economic cost may have been, they continued to do it. So they not only survived, but they thrived, and discrimination continued in our society. So we passed laws that forbid discrimination, and that's the right thing to do. That is government intervention of a form that is absolutely necessary. I'll give you another example where they said we shouldn't do it. Minimum wage laws. They would say let the labor markets themselves set the minimum wage, to which we said no. As a society, we have concluded that when people work a 40-hour week, we want them to get enough money to put food on the table and buy clothing for their kids. That is simply a core value that we believe in, and these are forms of market intervention that we believe in. So those are the three rules. I don't want to go on for longer than I'm supposed to, but those are the three rules. Now, are they completely, by the way, let me add one footnote to that. One of the cases in the core value context that made me think about this quite deeply was a subprime case. We began to make subprime lending cases in 1999. And it's not that I'm so prescient about these things, but anybody who had dug into that area knew that a vast majority of these loans would not be repaid, and knew that the loans were being extended, securitized, sold off into the pipeline of the capital markets in a way that benefited everybody other than those who were ultimately holding the notes and, in many cases, the borrower. We tried to bring a case about it and were shut down by the OCC, the Office of the Control of the Currency, who was there really as the puppet of all the banks. When we went into court, it was us versus all the major banks in the OCC. And we lost that case, interestingly enough, and I say this for a political reason, until we got to the Supreme Court. All the way to the United States Supreme Court. It was kind of an issue of federalism, jurisdiction. The point I wanted to make, just to show you life is not ever totally predictable. The reason we won in the Supreme Court is we got what are now considered the 4 traditional liberal votes. But we needed 5. 5, if you're a lawyer, is the most important number in the world, because with 5 votes, the Supreme Court can do anything. They can choose the president, they can do whatever. And the 5th vote we got was Justice Scalia. Nobody would have predicted it, but here was somebody who actually looked at the issue of states' rights and looked at the issue of market behavior and said, you know what, these guys are right. So I make that point to say but don't prejudge your opposition and presume they will always move in lockstep or be totally predictable. But we ultimately won, giving us, not until 2008, so it's too late obviously, the power to dig more deeply into the subprime area. But back in 2004, when this was still pending, I wrote an article in the New Republic in which, many other points, I said, make no mistake, most of these loans will not be repaid. And this was something that I think virtually anybody who was active in that market understood and needed to pay attention to. Of course, they didn't, and so we had a cataclysm. Those are the 3 rules. And they may seem obvious, and as I said at the very beginning, if we had not had a spasm of collective amnesia in the nation, I would believe that we could all have sort of internalized these rules and said, yeah, this makes common sense. These are reasons for the government to be involved in in the marketplace, and we should act on this. What we are seeing now, and we can discuss if you want, Dodd-Frank and whether it was sufficient. In my view, it clearly wasn't. Simon has written powerfully about the fact that it was insufficient, too big to fail. Institutions are still too big to fail. We have, in fact, seen greater concentration in the capital markets, not less. We have the leverage is reduced slightly, but still there. We have made the major banks, in the great phrase, we have given, we have socialized the risk and privatized the gain, while we have guaranteed all their borrowing. So we have increased their capacity to make money on the spread, which is, of course, how banks make money. I mean, understand, banks make money because we give them money and they pay us, let's say, 2% for it, and they lend it out at 8. If instead of paying us 2, they pay 0, but they're still lending at 8, that spread increases, they make more money. By having the federal government stand behind the banking community, the too big to fail institutions, their borrowing costs have gone down. By driving interest rates close to 0, because of the recession, their borrowing costs have gone down. They are increasing the spread, so they're making more money, which is how we've made them solvent again. It wasn't TARP, it was this interest rate spread that has done it. So things are getting worse from the perspective of genuine competition out there, not better. Let me leave you with one final thought. Changing all this is extraordinarily difficult. And as I said, despite whatever hesitations we may have had about the way President Obama has addressed some of these issues, he has been trying desperately to push, maybe not hard enough, but he's been trying desperately to push to get us into a point where we have a new social contract and a new understanding of what the market should be. 2 books, and I'm not here as a professor, I'm not here to sort of proselytize, but 2 books I would recommend that you read, because for me at least, back when I was in college, they captured the difficulty of social change, and they are not often enough read and put on syllabi, whatever. The first is Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which describes how individuals respond to institutions that have failed. Whether it's a political party, a consumer products company, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty shows you it discusses the internal dynamic that attaches. And the other book is Manker Olson's The Rise and Decline of Nations, which is also essentially the equivalent of his Logic of Collective Action, which discusses the role of interest groups in society in leading to a calcification, stagnation, that results, whether the interest group is a union, a corporation, a student organization, elected officials, editorial boards. We are all interest groups vying for power, wealth, accretion, whatever it may be, and it leads ultimately to a stagnation that is very hard to overcome. And that rigidity is what makes it so hard for society to change. And so whatever frustrations we may have at the slow pace of change, understand that those books, I think, describe why that is. And so my final plea to you, I'll give you one plea and then one final last thought, I promise, and then we'll do questions. The plea is don't give up on that effort to change things. It is a frustrating task, to say the least. There were days as Attorney General when I had moments of great elation that I thought we had changed things, when I thought, aha, whatever context, the environment, wages, Wall Street, we have really had a breakthrough here. And then you see the cataclysm several years later and realize nothing has changed. So despite that, don't stop the effort to change things. And whatever your vision of change may be, push back vigorously, because that is what it takes. And the last thought, and this is maybe off point, having just given this sort of mini talk about why government is a necessary player here, I want to, in 10 seconds, suggest an area of activity that is, again, not sufficiently paid attention to, and that is shareholder power. The corporations that have, to a great extent, made the decisions that brought us to the precipice are owned by somebody. That somebody is you. And the capacity to use shareholder democracy to reclaim decision-making from companies is something that has not really been focused upon. Who owns the companies? Mutual funds, pension funds, endowments, you through your 401k. We need to reinvigorate shareholder democracy, because regulation cannot be and will never be the entire answer. And so even though we do not yet have the mechanisms given to us by the SEC to get proxy resolutions to reclaim decision-making about who's on the board of directors, long-term, I think that is the area of power. Those are the muscles we need to flex in the long term to really reinvigorate our economy. All right, well, look, I've talked for a good twice as long as I was supposed to. I apologize for that. I welcome Simon, I think, as the first question, and then I leave myself open to all of you to throw questions at me. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate the invitation.
Please pass it to your right, my left, and our two staff members will collect them. They have their hands raised right now. And we'll start with Simon Johnson.
Thanks very much for that actually encouraging and inspiring talk, which we don't hear very often, such a positive, upbeat message. But let me ask you the question that I'm asked frequently, to which I really don't have a good answer, which is, what should any one individual do? I mean, you discussed the broader social processes, you discussed the sort of the war for ideas here, but as an individual, as somebody who has some retirement money, somebody who has a job, somebody who votes, somebody who probably doesn't get to talk to Justice Scalia very often, but as a regular person, how should they see the opportunities here? What should they prioritize? Who should they be backing, and on what basis?
Well, if what you mean, whom should you back politically? Look, I want to stay a little bit away from names or even parties. Obviously, I ran as a Democrat. I believe deeply in the principles of the Democratic Party, but I'm not here to give sort of an overtly political speech. But I would say this. What they should be backing is perhaps the words on the front of this podium, that ideas matter, and that what we should demand of our elected leaders is some greater coherence, and we should not permit this sort of gauzy rhetoric that we've been living with over the past couple of years. I mean, I'll give you an example of that. I would suggest to you that Paul Ryan's budget proposal is a complete smoke and mirrors game. This is the budget of somebody who claims he's going to be rigorous on the debt, but he adds $6 trillion of debt over the next 10 years, refuses to raise taxes, refuses to deal honestly with how we control healthcare costs, and does nothing but say the poorest of our society will absorb 2/3 of the costs. That's not a real answer. Maybe an answer for some, but it's not a real answer that passes any philosophical or economic critique that I think is real. On the other hand, President Obama's budget isn't a whole lot better. It doesn't deal with the debt issue. It doesn't deal with the equity issues terribly well. It doesn't deal with healthcare containment at all, and did not address how we're really going to control Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And so I think the first thing we as citizens should do is demand a greater level of integrity in the substantive answers that we're getting from our elected officials. And that may be an amorphous answer, but I think simply standing up and saying, no, that doesn't solve the problem. People don't ask I can reduce it to my day job now, or evening job, which is to ask questions of people on a TV show. Most hosts, and I don't say this critically, I try not to criticize my colleagues, but most don't ask the follow-up questions. And without asking the rigorous follow-up question, they hence embrace the sort of the premise of the answer that was given by whoever gave the answer, and they don't push them back hard enough to say, wait a minute, that doesn't work. I had this conversation I had with Rand Paul today. He begins his new book, which is fun reading. It's about liberty, and he begins by saying liberty, and he embraces John Stuart Mill's view of a self-regarding act. Liberty is the ability to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't affect other people. And I said to him, Congressman, that's great. I agree with you on that. The problem is virtually everything you do does affect other people. And if, in fact, everything you do affects other people, then don't we, as the other people, have the right to make some decisions with you? And I use the example of pollution. And so, in other words, be more demanding. And even he kind of got flummoxed a little bit there because he could see he's a very smart guy. He could see where the logic was going. And he could see that this was going to go right at the heart of his libertarian worldview. And so challenge people intellectually. And over time, I think we will, by doing so, elevate the general nature of our political conversation. All right.
This question doesn't have any name. Is it possible to change the role of government in the market without first reforming the way political campaigns are financed in the United States?
You know, I think so. And I say that not out of any false sense of optimism, nor out of any, of course we need to change campaign finance. Campaign finance is a mess. Elected officials spend vast amounts of time raising the money. No matter how good and honorable they may be, they then feel emotionally somehow tied to their donors. Not that there's a corrupt bargain, but there is just sort of an implicit emotional connection there. Should we have public financing of elections? I wish we would. You know, somebody made the point, President Obama is going to raise and spend $1 billion running for the presidency next year, as though that was a huge sum of money. My response was, that's not very much. To choose the person who fills the most important position in the world, when we wrote a check to Goldman Sachs, I can't have, every half hour I have to mention them, for $12.9 billion to unwind their credit default swaps with AIG, and we just wrote the check without even thinking about it, $12.9 billion, a check to one company, $1 billion to pick the president isn't a lot. What we should do is really take some amount of public money and fund the sorts of debates that would inform the public and eliminate private giving that is corrosive. So that's what we should do. Can we solve these issues before we deal with that? Yes. If there were a political movement of equal power to the Tea Party on the other side. And here I'll be somewhat partisan for a minute. What has troubled me a great deal about the way President Obama handled the unwinding of the Wall Street dynamic was that having bailed out the banks, we then turned off the spigot. Having bailed out the banks, we didn't negotiate with them to get the reform back that we needed. And having bailed them out, he did not harness the public's anger at the bailout to create a political momentum that could have led to the reform we needed. In other words, the very process of the negotiation he undertook, his desire apparently to be buddies with them at the moment when what we needed was to be very harsh and critical of them, permitted the anger, the very real public anger at what was happening, to be funneled into the Tea Party rather than towards support for a very different political agenda. And if he had done what FDR did, which was to use the anger wisely, not that I'm as I've said, cheap populism is not a whole lot better than cheap libertarianism. But at least understand how you can use the emotions and harness that energy and harness what was real palpable anger and still is palpable anger to good purpose. And what he did by having such equanimity and being so nice to the investment banks was give away the opportunity to do that. And so I think if we had had that moment, President Obama could have harnessed that energy and given us a very different and more aggressive reform agenda.
You talked a little bit about regulators not having the most finely tuned minds. How do we change that? How do we get the best people, the most intelligent people, and the best analysts as regulators as well as on the side of the market?
This is a tougher issue. In Europe, oddly, being in government service is viewed as being at the pinnacle of one's possible career. And I don't know quite why or how that is, but people in Europe go to the top écoles and they go into government service, and people give them the respect. Here, somehow being a bureaucrat is viewed as being, the depths. So you couldn't get a real job in the private sector, and we have to change that mindset. And how we go about doing that is a deeper issue. I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to it, but I think we should begin we could begin by not speaking in such derogatory terms of government service. Let's begin by recognizing that most of what people do in government service is, if not noble, is important, is thoughtful, is an effort to protect the public, and people are there for the right reasons. There are certainly bad counterexamples, but if we brought that sensibility to our description of government and didn't always denigrate it, and I think this began with President Reagan, where government became the enemy. If you look at the contrast between the era of President Kennedy, when public service was noble, versus President Reagan, when it became somehow an unfortunate place for people who couldn't do any better, we need to change the way we talk about the government.
What role do you think MBA programs contribute to the culture of excess on Wall Street and also to the lack of excellent regulation?
How many of you are in the MIT, in the Sloan School? Oh my, I didn't realize that. Wow. But only one of you wants to work for Goldman. Well, that's interesting. That means the rest of you were clearly not telling the truth. Here's what I would say. I think have you seen the movie Inside Job? Yeah, I mean, it was one of the more subtle points. There weren't a whole lot of subtle points in that movie. It was sort of, it was kind of like being hit over the head with a baseball bat, but that's fine. I mean, it was superb in what it did. But one of the more subtle points was to raise the issue of the intersection between academia and the crisis, which is, and frankly, it's the only place, in articles or movies that I've seen that raised. I think it raises important questions about the degree to which our business schools and our law schools, by the way, I mean, I think our law schools are equally culpable in that respect, have taught sets of principles and paradigms that we now have to seriously rethink. Now, the underbelly of the argument that Charles Ferguson made was that this was because the professors were essentially consultants and were getting big sums of money. I don't want to challenge motive right now. I mean, whether that's right or wrong, the conclusion you reach that we got to rethink what we teach and how we teach it is certainly correct. And so I don't say that to denigrate either the education here or up the river a little bit, but I do think we've got to challenge some of what we were teaching. The whole issue of financial engineering, which was a product of a lot of incredibly smart people believing the premise that the more credit default swaps there were, the less risk there was in the economy. Clearly, it didn't work out so well. So we got to rethink some basic things.
Now that the markets are completely global and banks are global, is it enough to legislate and regulate domestically? Well,
it's not enough, but it's also, but the fact of globalized markets is not an excuse not to do it. We still have sufficient market share and enough capital comes out of the United States so that there are very few players who would say we will not participate in the American markets because they now have capital requirements of X or disclosure obligations of Y. Now, there's the notion that we somehow have to ourselves, think of the metaphor I used before when Merrill Lynch said we're not as bad as our competitors. That sort of dumbing down to a lowest common denominator, which has occurred in the private sector, which is an argument for government defining those principles. We can't fall into the same trap in terms of the sort of regulatory triage, as they refer to it, saying, aha, the Brits are going to do something different, therefore we won't do anything. And the reality is, frankly, the other areas where capital markets are pretty healthy, Europe in particular, they've been more aggressive than we on certain issues, in particular trying to address too big to fail and capital requirements and some disclosure issues. And so I think, yes, the issue is a theoretical issue, but it's not an excuse not to put in place the right rules and regs right now. And certainly if you believe, as I do, that our share of the capital markets will diminish, not increase, over the next 20 years, you'd better use our capacity to do it now, because 20 years from now it will be even harder.
What do you see as a solution to the issue of personal liabilities to the state, such as Social Security, Medicare, those kinds of things, long term?
It's not complicated in the sense of that there are only a limited number of solutions that are possible. And so you can have a spectrum of social contracts we can all choose. Do I think we should raise the retirement age for Social Security? Yes. Demographics is such that when you've all seen these articles, no doubt. When we created Social Security, the life expectancy was actually below the retirement age that was set. I mean, this was, if an insurance company tried to get away with what they created, we'd sue them. because they're basically saying nobody's going to be alive to collect on their insurance, but we're going to sell it to them anyway. So, but since then, we haven't raised the retirement age sufficient to deal with the problem that we've created. So yes, raise the retirement age for Social Security. Raise marginally, and do it gradually. It's you guys who are going to pay the price, not me. The other thing we should do is raise the threshold, the income level that is subject to the payroll tax. Right now it caps at $106,800, which makes the payroll tax essentially a regressive tax. And as the wealthier you are, the lower the percentage of your total income you pay in payroll tax. Raise the $106,800 to 90% of all income or higher, so that you can at least both make it more progressive and get the revenue. Medicare, we have to rethink what we provide and at what price. There's no question we have to do that. And Ezra Klein, who's a really superb writer for the Washington Post, said of the federal government, it is an insurance company with an army. What does he mean by that? Federal dollars go to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, 3 insurance products, and defense. Right? Defense spending we got to cut. We know we can. We can cut it by some hundreds of billions of dollars a year without any real significance. On the insurance side, we got to either raise premiums, cut access, or stop providing as much stuff. We have to do that in each of them, and the reason to do it is not to be mean-spirited, because I also believe we can increase taxes on the wealthy. We never should have extended the Bush tax cuts, so you do a little bit of both. But the reason to do it is so we have the dollars available to invest in the future, which means education, infrastructure, R&D. Those are the things that are being squeezed out of our federal budget by an inability of our political system to limit the entitlement programs. Understand all the cuts they've talked about so far, and I'm sure you've seen this, but it's a hugely important number. All the cuts they've talked about so far come from the 12% of the federal budget that is non-defense discretionary spending. What does that bureaucratic term mean? It means NIH. It means Pell Grants. It means the EPA. It means SEC. It means all the things that we really do care about to make ourselves competitive for the future. And so the politics of the moment have led us to keep separate and hold sacrosanct the areas of spending that, yeah, they're important. We want to protect them. I'm the last person to say let's destroy that social safety net, just the opposite. But we are destroying our investment in the future, and that is even more injurious. All right, last question, then I've given you everything I can.
It's a perfect segue. Ezra Klein in the Washington Post argues that President Obama is ideologically the equivalent of a early 1990s moderate Republican. Do you think that's accurate? And do you think that there's a way that progressives can fully lay out a more coherent financial worldview?
Look, that's a little harsh on him. Calling anybody Republican is kind of mean. But, but there's an interesting point buried in that statement. There's another spectacular book you should read by Matt Miller called The 2% Solution. And in the sort of early parts of that book, he goes through, and Matt Miller is also a writer for the Washington Post. He writes another book, The Tyranny of Dead Ideas, which I think came out about a year ago. He compares, and I think the 2% Solution, the sort of healthcare plans that were being proposed by John Kerry and maybe, I don't know, George Bush. I think that shows you when the book was written, to the healthcare plans that were being proposed by President Nixon. President Nixon had a more expansive social welfare program than John Kerry. And trust me, John Kerry is one of my favorite people. I really like the guy, but it shows you how far the spectrum of our political discourse shifted over the course of that 15 or 20 years, and how sort of constricted our sense of what government could do or should do for people became. Now, so that addresses Ezra's first observation that sort of moderate Republicans 20 years ago were in fact more expansive in their social agenda than President Obama. That may be a fair point. What should we do? As I said in answer to Simon's first question, get out there, participate. There are people, and again, I don't want to start naming names, there are people who I think are saying really good things who are in the political world, who deserve a lot of support, who are articulating a different agenda. But even if you disagree with me 180 degrees, get out there and participate, because citizen activism is good. And I'll end by making bizarrely a kind comment about the Tea Party. Even though I disagree with virtually everything they say of substance, it is grassroots politics. And that is what changes America. It's not politicians. And I used to make this point when I was in office. Politicians, I'm hard-pressed to think of a significant political movement in this nation that has been led by elected officials. Every significant bit of social change has begun with grassroots politics that only later in the game was embraced by elected officials. So get out there and do the grassroots politics. All right, thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here.